Hello everyone, my name is Vrinda. I think I've met some of you in the offline mode as well, but just like a brief introduction. I'm in the third year of our DevSoc. I was the previous vice president, and I've been debating for almost 2 years now. Um, I chose this session because this is honestly one of my favorite sessions, which Akshat took in the past 2 years. And here's where I want to shout out to two really important people, and that's Pratyush. When we were in our first year, Pratyush was in our third year, so Pratyush was taking a lot of the workshops and he's responsible for teaching us things when we were in our first year. And then of course Akshat in both of the 2 years took this workshop for us, which is motion types and burdens. Again, I think that this workshop in and of itself was a workshop which I personally revisited the most, simply because just to get clarity and just to ensure that you know each and everything regarding various motion types and you don't get confused, all of those things. I personally had to revisit this session quite a lot, and that's why I wanted to go ahead and take this session for you all. So yeah, that with that being the introduction, we can just move on to the next slide. Okay, so there are a couple of points to note. First, that there's no hard and fast rule in particular with regards to this workshop. These are just general guidelines which apply to most but not all debates. So, by guidelines, what we mean is that these are rule of thumbs. So, while you're debating, we recommend you all to go ahead and keep these in mind, and how it's a rule of thumb, so it's likely to apply to a lot of circumstances. But this workshop in and of itself is based off of a manual which is used at like a world's level. So that manual also keeps on changing. So debating as a sport, like in other sports as well, rules change. Similarly, the guidelines etc are also open to change. So with criticisms or with other things which come across, there are likely changes which go ahead and take place over time, which is why these are not hard and fast rules and they can change with time. For the next year or so we'll be there, so we'll help you all when it comes to these changes. But yeah, with time we expect you all to also keep up with the changes which come across, which brings me to the second point as well, is that all of these are dynamic things, so they go ahead and they do change over time. Yep, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so let's start off with the very basics, some of which we've already covered in the previous sessions. First, what is a motion? Motion just refers to a topic which is debated in a round, and it can be phrased in multiple ways, but they usually start with the words this house. Now, this brings me to the third point, which is what exactly is this house? This house usually refers to the state or a collective group of neutral actors, where and in other times it's actually mentioned who in particular the house is. So they go ahead and mention particular actors etc which are already mentioned in the motion, and that in and of itself forms the house. And so a lot of the times, apart from the motion, you're also given a context slide. So this context slide basically goes ahead and provides you with additional information which is necessary to have a functioning debate. Any information on this slide is assumed to be true within that debate. So if there's some context provided, and then there is an info, I mean as an info slide, and then there is a motion provided. So for instance, this house supports de-dollarization is the motion, but before that they'll provide you with a context slide in terms of what exactly is the meaning of de-dollarization. So that's just an example in terms of what exactly is a context slide, and at all points in time whatever is written in a context slide is taken to be true. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. So, what are the various types of motions? And we'll cover each and every one of these motions in great details. You primarily have motions divided into three types. First is a policy motion. This looks like this house would, for instance, ban cigarettes. That's your policy motion. Second looks like your analysis motions. There are four types under this. First could be a this house believes that motion. Second could be a this house supports or opposes motion. Third could be a this house regrets motion. Fourth could be a this house prefers motion. We'll get into each and every one of these motion types in the next couple of slides. And lastly, you have actor motions. So this house as A would do X. So A and X, what exactly do we mean by these things? We'll go ahead and cover all of these. So yeah, we can go to the next slide. So first motion type is the policy motion. And what does that look like? We'll cover in the next slide. Yep. So a policy motion looks like a this house would do X motion, or a THW motion is a policy motion. Examples of this looks like this house would ban drugs, or this house would reserve a third of the seats for women in parliament. So first, what does X exactly mean? X is generally a policy in and of itself which is going to be implemented. Now these are normative debates, which is whether the policy should be implemented or whether the policy should not be implemented. These debates aren't about, oh, whether this policy in the real world will be implemented, or whether the policy in the real world can be implemented and stuff like that. These debates are not necessarily about that. So you just have to go ahead and debate insofar as this, like, if this policy is implemented, should it be implemented on government and that's the government burden, and or should it not be implemented and that's the opposition burden, and we'll come up and we'll go into details about those later. But the last thing which I want to go ahead and cover is government fiat. With that we can move to the next slide. So next slide would cover that. Yep. So, what is government fiat or proposition fiat? So, fiat generally means that government teams can assume that the motion will pass the parliament. So, insofar as the motion is that this house will, can we go to the previous slide? One second. Yep. This house will reserve a third of the seats for women in parliament. So the example of that literally is this. So if you on opposition argue that male parliamentarians will not let this bill pass, this criticism explains that why it's hard to pass the bill. So this sort of comment is not necessarily a legitimate constructive for op to say, which is to say proposition fiat is nothing but just the assumption that whatever policy the government team is suggesting in terms of, for instance, banning drugs, whatever policy they have to suggest, it will pass the parliament and it will be cleared. But secondarily, insofar as it's the government would have resources to go ahead and implement that policy in and of itself. So it cannot be argued that, oh, government would not be able to do this, or government wouldn't be able to ban drugs because government doesn't have the resources to ban drugs. So these sort of criticisms regarding whether or not the policy will pass the parliament, etc., are not necessarily a part of the debate, and therefore government has the fiat to go ahead and say that the policy will pass. So fiat also applies to a range of alternatives on opposition as well. So opposition can also have a counter policy, and we'll get to that in the next slide in terms of how you can go ahead and utilize this fiat on opposition side as well. We can go to the next slide. Yep. So what do you have to do on side government and what do you have to do on side opposition? This is where I'll take examples of the motion this house will ban drugs. So first is you have to on side government define the motion, establish a need for the policy by defining the problems. So how do you go ahead and define a motion? That's the first thing, right? We can go to the next slide and we'll cover that. Okay, first things first, what does a definition necessarily mean? So, in a lot of the motions, you'll have to define keywords. That's pretty much something which you'll have to do in all of the motions in and of itself. So, what does that necessarily mean? Definitions, so you have to like debate at a level of generality which is implied in the motion. So, if I take the example of this house will ban cosmetic surgeries, what does a legitimate definition of ban look like? You can go ahead and exclude abnormal examples from the definition. So you can say that we'll ban cosmetic surgeries for everyone except individuals who have gone ahead and faced burns. So if their body has gone ahead and faced severe form of burns, etc., in that sort of instance, we'll go ahead and we'll prevent or we'll not ban cosmetic surgeries. But in other cases where individuals want to go ahead and do surgeries out of their like passion, etc., or because they want to go ahead and do it out of joy or whatever, in those instances, for instance, in normal circumstances except abnormal circumstances, we are going to go ahead, or for beautification purposes we are going to ban this sort of cosmetic surgery. That is a valid definition, so you can still go ahead and exclude abnormal definitions. Second way to define is just to go ahead and have a detailed mechanism to implement the motion. So what does banning here look like? Is it at a manufacturing level or a retailing or at a retail level, or are you going to ban like the sale of the surgery, etc.? What exactly do you mean by ban? That has to be defined in a proper manner. But what is an illegitimate form of definition? Where you only include abnormal examples. So, for instance, if you're side government and you say, we'll only ban cosmetic surgeries, but for individuals who are really young or for people under 18. So that's an illegitimate form of this definition, because what you're going ahead and doing is excluding a large subset of individuals or population. So the idea is this, that if the actual adjudication core or whosoever has set the motion wanted it to be specific to a very specific stakeholder or a certain stakeholder, they would have done that already. But since that's not the case, eliminating such a huge number of individuals from the debate in and of itself is not a legitimate form of definition. Second thing which you shouldn't do and forms an illegitimate part of the definition is unnecessarily time set or place set without having a strong justification. So if you say that we'll ban cosmetic surgeries, but only in India, or that's basically time setting it, place setting it, or you say that we'll only go ahead and ban cosmetic surgeries or till a particular year or something along those lines, that's time setting it. So, or in a lot of motions, people go ahead and say that we'll only do this between this year or that year. All of these, without strong justifications for it in and of itself, form an illegitimate form of a definition. Because again, if that were how the people who set the motion, if that's how they wanted it to be debated as, they would have done it already. A lot of the times, then, insofar as you don't have strong justifications for these necessarily do not stand. Third is advancing a model which is not within the spirit of the motion, i.e., squirreling. So, in this, or what does squirreling mean? It simply means this, that when you go ahead and set definitions which lower the burden of proof within the debate. So, if I take an example of this house will ban the shooting of animals, on gov it's, if you run the definition that by shooting we mean camera shooting, or how we'll record these people or take pictures, and that's what you mean by shooting, that's necessarily squirreling the debate, because what was meant by shooting was actually like taking the lives of animals by shooting them with like guns, weapons, whatever. So then it forms an illegitimate definition when you squirrel or when you lower the burden within that debate in and of itself. Okay, so I'll quickly cover the next slide as well in terms of what happens when you go ahead and have an illegitimate form of definition. Yep, we can go to the next slide. So I'll not go into details of this because this doesn't happen frequently, but we can cover this later on. But what I just wanted to go ahead and cover is, insofar as you have an illegitimate definition taking place in prime minister, only the leader of opposition can go ahead and challenge that definition. So then the debate necessarily boils down to which definition is bought by the judges, stuff like that. Necessarily, just because you do a definition challenge in LO does not mean that it's going to stand. And only the LO can start a definition challenge, DLO cannot start it, and stuff like that. But yeah, this is what happens if you face like an illegitimate form of definition, which makes the debate happen in a which takes the debate to such a place where it cannot necessarily happen. But with that, can we just go back to the slide which mentioned the burdens? Like, I think we have to go back 2 slides. Yeah. So this brings me back to, what do you necessarily do in a policy debate if you're side government and side opposition? So first is you have to go ahead and define the motion. I've already explained how do you go about defining a motion. You do it in a general way. You define basically the key words. So for example, if you have to ban drugs, what exactly would this ban necessarily look like? You have to go ahead and define that. And then you establish a need by identifying the problems which go ahead and take place. So why do you necessarily need to go ahead and ban drugs in and of itself? You can go ahead and talk about various problems, and then secondarily you propose a solution to those problems within the model, and that forms your policy X. So, insofar as you're able to identify the problems which take place in status quo basically means the present world. At that point in time, you have to go ahead and suggest a policy X with a model. Model basically means how would that policy pan out. So, you cannot just say, oh, we'll ban it. You need to describe what that ban looks like. This doesn't mean that your 7 minutes of prime minister's speech is just the model, no, but some sort of fleshing out or some sort of description of what does the model look like or policy look like has to be done. Last thing then you have to do on government is prove how the policy solves or significantly reduces the problem you have established within the world in and of itself. That's what you have to do on government. On opposition, you can go ahead and do two things. First is defend status quo or the present world. So I want to be very clear in terms of what does the comparative look like. On government, you have a policy taking place or a model, and on opposition in case 1 you are defending the status quo. So here you have to prove that the policy X will make the status quo worse, and that status quo is better than their world. So then you have to comparatively prove that insofar as the policy is implemented on government, comparatively speaking, the present world is a better world when that policy never existed in and of itself. The second thing you can go ahead and do is you can agree with their problems, that yes, these problems do exist, but instead of, for instance, in the example, this house would ban cigarettes, what you can go ahead and suggest that instead of banning, we'll restrict cigarettes, etc., in and of itself. So some form of restrictions, etc., in terms of having a particular amount of like cigarettes, etc., being sold, etc., can take place. This is a counter prop. What a counter prop does is a couple of things. First, that changes the comparative within this debate. So in DPM, you cannot go ahead and talk about the harms of status quo because opposition is no longer defending status quo. In DPM, you have to go ahead and compare the two policies which have taken place. First policy is where you have banned cigarettes, which is your policy and gov, in comparison to their policy where they have restricted the consumption or sale, purchase, whatever, of cigarettes in and of itself, whatever they describe the counter proposition to be. Here, the amount of fiat government teams have, in counter prop opposition teams also have the same fiat. So whatever, so it's also then assumed that opposition team can also go ahead and ensure that their policy of restricting the consumption, sales, whatever, of cigarettes is something which is also going to go ahead and it will be passed within the parliament in and of itself. So then they also enjoy the same form of fiat. Before I go and continue with fiat, I want to quickly compare fiat and alternatives. So alternatives could basically look like opposition teams saying that we, instead of banning, can do A, B, C, D, or like a couple of other things. Here, what they aren't going ahead and doing is sticking or defending just one particular alternate form of policy. What they are doing is that they are suggesting a couple of other ways this thing can be dealt with. So I want to talk about alternatives and counter props here. What happens with the way alternatives and counter props are credited is that they have to be mutually exclusive from government's policy. That's the first thing. This basically means that it cannot be that for the consumption of alcohol, government says that we are going to go ahead and ban consumption of alcohol till the age of 18. Opposition says we'll ban it till the age of 21. That's not a mutually exclusive policy, which basically means that your policy of banning till age 21 still has the elements of ban till 18. So does exist some overlap between the policies between gov and op. So therefore, the policy or the burden on opposition is to not go ahead and do this. Therefore, the policy slash counter prop or alternatives they're supposed to suggest, that is, if they go that route, are simply things which are supposed to be mutually like exclusive of each other. Therefore, an overlap is not supposed to be there. That's first. Second thing, in terms of differences between alternatives and counter prop, is simply to just go ahead and say that the comparative within the debate does not change when you suggest alternatives. So on government, you have your policy, and on opposition, you are still defending status quo insofar as you go ahead and give alternatives. But the comparative changes between gov and op when you have a counter prop. So, for instance, if you have one particular counter policy you want to go ahead and stick to, which is instead of banning, we'll restrict on opposition, at that point in time, that changes the comparative. That does not necessarily happen when you give multiple alternatives in and of itself. So that's one thing in terms of difference between counter prop and alternatives. So in short, in case of alternative, the binary still remains government policy on gov and status quo on op. And in case of a counter prop, you have government policy versus opposition policy, and then you have to deduce which one is better. Another thing I want to talk about when it comes to model is how does it have to be presented. Note that your model is supposed to come in the PM speech in and of itself. But your model, what happens in DPM speech? Only two things. First, if opposition has particular questions in regards to your model, they can just be clarified in DPM. Therefore, second thing, which is a substantive part of your model cannot come in DPM. So your model has to be, or pretty much the entirety of it has to be covered in PM, and only clarifications which opposition asks in terms of questions, etc., or if there are certain things which need to be clarified about your model which has already come in PM, can go ahead and come in DPM. Yep, with that, we are done with policy motions. Chirag, we can skip to the next couple of slides. Yep. Analysis motions. Before that, I'll take up doubts on policy motions and then we'll go to analysis motions. One second. Okay, yep, we have nothing. Great. In case anyone has any doubts, just letting you all know, feel free to unmute, feel free to use the raise your hand option, feel free to use the chat box anytime throughout this presentation. Yep, perfect. Okay, so for instance, if you have, I'll try to give you an example of a particular motion. One second. Uh, Tanvi, if you're here, can we pull up Premchand quarters?
Oh, give me a minute.
I'll give you an example of this through a particular motion.
Which one? India should not try population wala ya fir adoption?
Let me see. Surveillance. Okay.
Oh,
Okay,
ruko.
so
You want me to send in the chat?
yep, if you can. This house supports the use of absolute surveillance during public health crisis.
1 second, I'm sending an info slide. First read that, then I'll send the
Oh
motion.
yeah, there was an info slide. Okay, so this can go ahead and give you all an example of what does an info slide look like. So everything within an info slide is taken to be true. I'm also reading it just to like get like a like a little recap of it. One second. Yep, so I'll just read it out loud. South Korea deployed extensive digital surveillance technology to fight the coronavirus outbreak. Their tracking strategy relied heavily on its digital infrastructure. Authorities accessed a wide range of data, which looks like smartphone location history, credit card transactions, immigration records, CCTV footage of confirmed patients to compile meticulous logs of their travel and contacts. The motion is this house supports the use of absolute surveillance during public health crisis. So if we convert this into a THW motion, so this house will basically use absolute surveillance during public health crisis. I'll just quickly write that. One second. Okay, so let's imagine this is the motion, right? This house will use absolute surveillance during public health crisis. Here, government has to go ahead and give you a model in terms of what does absolute surveillance looks like. I think the info slide also helps them when it comes to building their model in terms of how they'll go ahead and utilize various technology. This technology is likely to go ahead and track your traveling records, etc. in and of itself. You can on opposition do two things. You can go ahead and either suggest that instead of using absolute surveillance, what you can go ahead and do is just like have the like restrictions you had during lockdown. So for instance, you go ahead and just have a lockdown. That's what for instance opposition suggests. So you stop people from going outside of their homes. So to go ahead and stop the public health crisis from increasing, if opposition suggests that acts as a counter policy in and of itself. So the end goal which both of the sides are trying to go ahead and come to, or the end benefit or end impact is the same, which is trying to go ahead and minimize the sort of impact the coronavirus has on the lives of people, basically to protect people, etc. Here, the way government does that is through absolute surveillance. The way opposition does that is, for instance, saying everyone goes under lockdown, so no one comes outside, stuff like that. Basically, what happened in India at that point in time, the comparative changes completely, right? So you then have to, from DPM and onwards, you have to compare whether the absolute surveillance policy is better or whether complete lockdown is better. That happens in the cases, in the case of counter prop. But note that these are also mutually exclusive things, which is that there isn't an overlap in and of itself. So in lockdown counter prop, you aren't going ahead and utilizing the exact mechanisms of like absolute surveillance. So that in and of itself is a counter prop. But instead, if you go ahead and suggest a toolkit of alternatives, so what you on opposition say is that if we oppose the or if absolute surveillance does not take place, we'll still defend status quo. But on our side, multiple things can happen, which looks like either you can have lockdown, or B, you can just go ahead and have you can go ahead and just have local tracking etc take place without absolute surveillance taking place, or you can go ahead and just do it in like, or you can go ahead and like track multiple regions without using this technology, but on the basis of the cases which come to hospitals etc of itself. What I'm trying to get to is you can go ahead and suggest alternatives or multiple alternatives which can go ahead and take place. So this does two things. First, what this does is that this ensures that the comparative does not change. So basically the comparative still remains the policy on government versus the status quo on opposition. But secondarily, here you don't have to adhere to just defending one policy, and you are not restricted to just defending your counter prop policy. So you can go ahead and suggest alternatives here. So that's the difference between counter prop and alternatives. A counter prop changes the comparative, whereas an alter it changes the comparative within this debate, whereas alternatives make the comparative stay in such a manner where opposition still has to defend status quo. So I'm hoping that that makes it slightly clearer in terms of what the difference is. Okay, we can go to analysis motion now. No worries, no worries. Next slide. This brings us to the second type of analysis motions. There are four types of analysis motions. Actually, let's do it this way. So within the first type, it's a THBT motion. There are two types of THBT motions. I just covered the first slide. One second. Yep. So a THBT motion is basically a this house believes that motion. A this house believes that motion has two types. This is type 1, which is simple. This house believes that X motions. Examples of this looks like this house believes that hustle culture has done more harm than good. Second looks like this house believes that apoliticality is immoral. We'll go ahead and discuss both of these examples in a second. But what do you necessarily have to do, or what does this exact motion type entail? First, these are value judgment debates. This basically means that you basically have to go ahead and debate about the truth or falseness of the motion, and not about whether or whether we should do something about it. What this basically means is that you don't have to go ahead and suggest that, oh, hustle culture has done more harm than good, therefore we should go ahead and come up with a policy etc. That's not what you have to do at all. What you just have to go ahead and debate is the statement that this house believes that hustle culture has done more harm than good. Is this true? That's what you have to defend on gov. Or is this statement false? That's what you have to go ahead and defend on opposition. So a model is not needed, but you still need to define key terms. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, this is regarding burdens. So I'll take an example of the motion. This house believes that apoliticality is immoral. So when it comes to defining key terms within this debate, first could look like what is apoliticality. Apoliticality simply means that you have little or no interest when it comes to politics, or you're not involved in political affairs, etc. How this could probably look like you're someone who does not vote, or you're someone who doesn't take sides when it comes to political debates, etc. Second thing could look like who are people who tend to be apolitical. So it could some probably be someone who is really really privileged, who is not affected by politics at all. You have interviews of celebrities going ahead and taking place when they are asked political questions, how they say that we are not affected by topics related to electricity etc, therefore we don't necessarily have a stance on these things. Or it could be someone who's probably like a laborer etc, or their real life in and of itself is quite hectic due to because of their like because of the background etc they come from. It's someone who's probably like from an impoverished area, so therefore it becomes difficult for them to go ahead and keep up with politics or political discourse, and therefore they don't even go to the voting poll, etc., in and of itself. So this could look like someone who is apolitical. You can also define what morality, immorality is. So that basically goes ahead and looks like defining key terms. On op, you also have to do the same thing. So if you agree with what government is saying, you can agree with it. If you don't agree, you don't agree. So what does the definition look like? That's something which I had covered beforehand. So that's why we had that slide. So you have to debate on a basis of generality. What teams tend to do is go ahead and usually give definitions which in particular or in some instances favor their side of the debate. Therefore, you all have to be very careful that is this definition something which is objectively true, or is like in general true, or this definition is given in a way which in particular favors just their side. So if you are opposition, you have to therefore listen really carefully and try to understand that whether this definition also can be used for your arguments, or is beneficial or is not beneficial, and accordingly redefine terms, give likelihood why what you are saying in terms of definition is a more general definition by pointing out how their definition is skewed, etc., in and of itself. But that's just on defining key terms. What do you in particular do in a THBT type 1 motion, which is different? First is provide metric for value judgment. So this is a value judgment debate, right? That's what we said. So what government can go ahead and define as value judgment is that if an act causes, if an act done by an individual causes more harm to the society, or if an act done by an individual can decrease the harm of others within the society, that's a good thing to do in and of itself. The way then government can go ahead and link this to their argument is simple. Insofar as individuals are apolitical, they do not go ahead and vote, they do not go ahead and take stance in political debates, especially if these are individuals who come from rich sections of the society or well-off sections of the society. They probably have the social capital to go ahead and they probably have the resources to go ahead and make a change, or probably their vote can act as something which can lead to a policy being passed, etc., in and of itself. This action can go ahead and therefore minimize the harm caused to a lot of other individuals within the society, or this can go ahead and increase the benefit to various individuals within that society, therefore meeting the value judgment metric which they had previously gone ahead and provided. This is just an example, of course. So the idea then remains this, that on government, the first thing you do is provide a value judgment metric, or the metric to go ahead and judge this debate upon in and of itself. And then you prove why your argument within that debate is able to meet that metric in and of itself. What do you do on opposition then? On opposition, you can do either of the two things which are mentioned, or you can do both of those things. What do I mean by that? First, is provide different metrics for value judgment and prove how your statement is false according to the new metric. So one value judgment metric which Gov provided was if your action can go ahead and lead to benefit of others, that's a good thing in and of itself. Op can go ahead and provide, or it's a moral thing to do in and of itself. What op can go ahead and say that look, that's not true. Individual rights should be upheld, individual interest should be upheld. If an individual chooses not to go ahead and vote, or if an individual basically goes ahead and has agency, therefore they can go ahead and decide how they act, and that should not be curbed. Therefore you should uphold individual choices, preferences, etc., and that is a good thing to do in and of itself, or that's a moral thing to go ahead and do in and of itself. So that's another a different value judgment metric which you have gone ahead and pushed forward on opposition. And then you can go ahead and prove that insofar as this is the case, on government side, what's happening is that you're curbing individual from implementing or acting on their choice. If an individual is choosing to be apolitical, for instance, you're going ahead and curbing that choice in and of itself. Therefore the statement is false according to the metric which we have gone ahead and provided. That's the first thing you can go ahead and do on opposition, which is just proving that this is the value judgment metric, we are able to meet it because on our side individuals have choices to exercise their apoliticality. On government they don't have that choice, or on government basically what you're doing is saying that exercising this choice is a wrong thing to do in and of itself. So that's how a government goes ahead and proves the statement to be false. Or what you can do is you can agree with government on their metric. that sure, if the metric is an action goes ahead and causes harm to others and therefore it's a bad action, whereas if an action goes ahead and an action goes ahead and minimizes the harm to others, it is a good action in and of itself, and that's the value judgment metric. You agree with that metric, but then you disagree on the way government is able to go ahead and meet the value judgment, i.e. you can go ahead and prove that in terms of harms or benefits being caused to individuals, when this is upheld, you can simply go ahead and just prove this, that on opposition at a point in time harm is not being caused to individuals, or apoliticality is not leading to harm being caused to individuals. So basically the way government argument is able to meet the value judgment, that's something which is not happening. You can go ahead and prove that on opposition side in and of itself as well, or how apoliticality is not meeting the value judgment metric which they have gone ahead and suggested. So if you just have one of these two when you're doing your case prep etc, or as matter or content, you can simply go for that. Otherwise, if you have both of these, then you can use even if analysis. So what you can go ahead and say that we disagree with their metric or value judgment metric, this should be the metric, but then you should also be prepared to justify your why your value judgment metric is the one which should be evaluated or which should be given more importance than government's metric. Once you are done with that, then you can go ahead and prove why you meet your metric better. But then additionally you can do and engage with their best case that even if what they're saying as their value metric, even if that is true, how government's apoliticality is not able to go ahead and meet their value judgment metric. So this is something which you can go ahead and do in a THBT type 1 motion. If I give you the example of the hustle culture motion, wait, do we have the time for that? I think we'll move on because we have a lot of slides to cover. I'll cover the hustle culture one later in the next THBT one. Yep, we can move to the next slide. Chirag, yep, perfect. This is the THBT type 2 motion, which is TH. So the previous one was this house believes that X. Here it's this house believes that A should do X. Now, what is A? A can be anyone, it can be any country, any entity, any person, social movement, etc. And X is again like an action or just something which you have to do in and of itself. So, in an example, this house believes that US should sanction Saudi Arabia. So again, this debate is about whether the statement is true from the perspective of a neutral observer. That remains the same. But even though it's a THMT motion, gov teams are encouraged to implement a model similar to a policy motion. So this house believes that US should sanction Saudi Arabia. Here you should go ahead and explain what exactly are these sanctions likely going to look like and how exactly is US going to go ahead and do this. So the burden here can be similar to a THBT motion as well as a THW motion. So the end idea is this, that you all must have noticed that the way burdens pan out within this type of a motion, it's similar to a policy motion in and of itself. So same burdens apply in terms of what GovOp have to prove, but it usually depends. Sometimes THBT type 1 motion burdens can also go ahead and apply. So it's an overlap between the two is what I'm trying to say. So for instance, you can go ahead and you're encouraged to give a model just for the sake of clarity in terms of what does this sanctioning look like. But you still have to go ahead and debate this from a neutral perspective in terms of the truth or falseness of this statement, whether or not US should sanction Saudi Arabia, or whether on Gov you should prove why they should do this, on Op you should prove that why should US not sanction Saudi Arabia. Yep, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so it's the next type we have is this house supports or this house opposes X motions. These are also called THS, THO motions, short for this house supports, this house opposes. Okay, so in this motion, I'll take two examples, which is this house supports universal basic income, or this house supports US involvement in the Middle East. Now, what exactly is X? X can be a person, group, institutions, cause, idea, value, or statement. So you can support anything or oppose anything. It's a huge pick of things. But the more important thing which I'm trying to prove is that are the next two things, which is first, teams cannot pick and choose which part of X to support or oppose, or they must support or oppose X in totality in all of its aspects and forms. So I'll first clear what exactly is universal basic income. Universal basic income is just an amount which is given by the government to the citizens of a particular country in a periodic manner. So it's given to all of the citizens. So if I'm side government, this house supports universal basic income, I have to go ahead and support universal basic income in its totality. I cannot say that, oh, I support universal basic income only when it's given to the poor people. I cannot say that. So I have to defend universal basic income in its totality. So sure, it goes to privileged people also who probably don't need this universal basic income as well. I on government also have to go ahead and defend that. Second thing is you have no fiat power, unlike a THW motion, so you need to debate likelihood. This is important. So, for instance, if it's that this house supports US involvement in Middle East, you cannot go ahead and say that US involvement in Middle East looks like non-violence or it just looks like sanctions or something diplomatic. How you cannot go ahead and just outrightly say these things. You have to, if you have to go ahead and describe what this US involvement in Middle East looks like, you have to give likelihood analysis that this is probably the most likely way US would be involved in Middle East. You can go ahead and do this in multiple ways. We've already covered all of this stuff in argumentation, etc. That's why I don't want to go a lot into what arguments can pan out, but just simply in terms of burdens, I wanted to make it clear that you have to go ahead and first oppose or support the same thing in totality. So if I flip the burden, right, this house opposes universal basic income, right? Government cannot go ahead and say that we oppose universal basic income but only for the individuals who are rich. That cannot happen. So they also then have to oppose universal basic income for individuals who are relatively impoverished or from like rural areas or backward, financially backward areas in and of itself. So that's what we mean by teams cannot pick and choose which part of X to support oppose. They must support oppose X in totality in all forms and aspects. But secondarily, there is no fiat power, so you have to go ahead and debate on the likelihood. Can we go to the next slide? Oh no, can we go back? One more thing I wanted to highlight within this motion is there are going to be harms and benefits on both sides. So in this house supports universal basic income, or let's take the example of the motion. This house supports the rise of hookup culture. There are going to be some benefits to the rise of hookup culture for sure. Opposition will go ahead and give you harms of hookup culture as well. Insofar as harms and benefits exist on both sides, what each team has to go ahead and prove is this. If I am government and I have to support the rise of hookup culture, what I would have to prove is that why benefits outweigh harms, or why benefits are more in scale, in magnitude, in severity, whatever, more than the harms. All of this comes down, a lot of it revolves around weighing. I'll prove that to you. I will actually cover weighing later on in other sessions. But the point I'm trying to say is that you have to, after some point, agree that insofar as both the sides, to an extent, have pro. Yep, cute. Insofar as both the sides have gone ahead and proven some harms and some benefits, you likely should engage in a manner where on government you will prove that why are benefits more than harms, or why on opposition why do harms outweigh benefits. The right word actually is not more, it's outweigh. I'm trying to avoid that because we haven't exactly taught you all weighing, but we will teach you weighing in the later half of the sessions. But yeah, the idea is insofar as harms outweigh benefits or benefits outweigh harms, that's how you'll have to debate these motions in particular. Yep, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is an interesting motion type. Before we go to this one, I'll take up questions. Actually, I'll take up questions after analysis motions because this is a long, like a couple of slides. Okay. This house regrets motions. This is the third type of analysis motions that there are. Let's like first go through examples in terms of what do these motions look like. First example you have is this house regrets the rise of teenagers at the forefront of social movements. This looks like Greta Thunberg being at the forefront of like environmental movements. You have Malala, etc. in of itself. Second is this house regrets the societal expectation of going to universities. Here, what exactly do you have to do? So first thing with regrets motion, because gov burdens can be slightly complicated to remember, because opposes, supports, you can kind of understand what you have to do. These words are huge giveaways. Like similarly, I want to draw the same analogy to regrets, right? Regrets as a word has a negative connotation to it. So kind of what I'm pushing you all towards is that on government the burden does revolve around some sort of a harm, right? So let's look at what do you have to do on gov and what do you have to do on op. So on government, there's what necessarily you have to do is that first you have to give regret metrics. Regret metrics basically go ahead and act as things which, so which basically act largely speaking as harms in and of itself in the present world or status quo. So the debate is about whether the world would have been a better place without the existence of X. So for instance, without the rise of the teenagers in the forefront of social movements, would the world be a better place? That's the burden which comes across on government. So the way to you go for the way you have to go ahead and do is simple. First, this is a retrospective debate. So you have to go ahead and only look at the harms on government. If I simply speak from government perspective, you have to look at the harms which have been caused from like retrospectively. So in the past, you cannot go ahead and speculatively think of harms which can come across in the future. That's not within the ambit of this debate. You have to go ahead and think of harms which have taken place till date as an outcome of, for instance, teenagers being in the forefront of social movements. So that's the first thing which you have to do is identify those harms in which have taken place in hindsight. Second is you have to go ahead and provide a counterfactual. So, for instance, insofar as teenagers would not have the rise of teenagers in the forefront of social movement would not have taken place, what is the likely counterfactual? Counterfactual basically means an imaginary world without X. So, an imaginary world where the rise of teenagers in the forefront of social movements would not have taken place, what would that world, imaginary world, have looked like? So, that's the counterfactual. So, a counterfactual here could have possibly been a world where teenagers are still a part of the social movement, but this rise is something which is being regretted. So, for instance, that could look like in scale or in number there are less number of teenagers who are involved in social movements in and of itself. That could probably be the counterfactual. So if I go ahead and talk about bed harms which have taken place as an outcome of teenagers being at the forefront of social movements, this could look like how other individuals like adults etc don't, for instance, take social movements seriously. For instance, if this is one of the harms which I've been able to identify in hindsight or retrospectively on site government, I can then go ahead and prove that insofar as that there are less teenagers who are involved in social movements as my counterfactual world, how would that be better off? Stuff like that. 1 second. Oh, okay. How would that be better off? Stuff like that. So my point is simple. A counterfactual world is necessary on site government, but you have no fiat power, which basically means you cannot go ahead and say you cannot paint. So again, the reason why you don't have fiat is because you could have painted like a really rosy world where there exists no problem, right? That's not the case. That's why the important word here is likely counterfactual. So you have to go ahead and give likelihood analysis that insofar as teenagers, the rise of teenagers at the forefront of social movements would not have taken place, what would the most likely world have looked like? And that's your counterfactual. So on government, the burden is prove that the world would be a better place if X didn't exist. You can go ahead and do that by comparatively pointing out your counterfactual and then going ahead and giving the harms of the present world, i.e., regret metrics. Oh, okay, no worries. Thank you for joining. Yep. All good. So at that point in time, that's what you have to do on government, which is prove that the world would be a better place if X didn't exist, and on opposition, prove that the status quo is better than counterfactual. So on opposition, you have to defend the present world, which is the status quo. We can move to the next slide, and we can go even more into the depths of the exact burdens on gov and op. Perfect. Let's start with gov. Define the motion, which we've covered in depth. What does that look like? So here you can define, for instance, can we just go back? I'll write the motion once again. This house regrets the rise of teenagers. ठीक है, we can go to the next slide. Yep, okay. So this house regrets the rise of teenagers at the forefront of social movements. First thing you could go ahead and probably define in the keywords is what are social movements like, what are their goals, aims, etc. Second, you can probably go ahead and define why exactly did the rise actually take place, why were teenagers actually like needed or necessary to be at the forefront of social movements, all of that in and of itself. So that could be a part of your definition, and I mean defining key terms and why did things take place in and of itself. Second is provide regret metrics, which basically means to prove why X is undesirable. So this basically goes ahead and means that how you all had to go ahead and provide metrics or value judgment metrics in a THBT X motion. Similarly, you have to go ahead and provide a regret metric which proves why X is undesirable. This could look like the various harms which are going ahead and taking place in and of itself and in the present world in status quo, retrospectively speaking. Then describe the counterfactual in the absence of X. That's the second thing you have to do on site gov, which is what does the counterfactual look like and the likelihood of that. And then third thing is prove how counterfactual would be better than status quo. This basically means that you have to go ahead and give comparative analysis in terms of insofar as this rise would not, for instance, have taken place, why would then the counterfactual world, which is the world without this rise, in comparison to status quo, would be better. That's government burden. Op burden is this: dispute government's regret metric or their judgment of X with respect to the regret metrics. So whatever regret metric they've gone ahead and stated, for instance, if it causes more harm to the people of the social move to it causes more harm to the legitimacy of the social movement. If that's the regret metric which government has gone ahead and set, on opposition you can go ahead and either dispute the regret metric as a whole, or you can go ahead and say that the judgment of X with respect to the regret metric. So you can say, even if the legitimacy of the social movement coming into question is the right regret metric, their arguments don't link back to that. So that's how you can go ahead and dispute the judgment of X with respect to the regret metric. Second thing you can go ahead and do is describe the counterfactual world. In a lot of instances, government teams don't go into depth about how the counterfactual world looks like. Opposition can just weaponize on that. Once government teams go ahead and give a little description about then that's the whole point. That's why on government, we would suggest that you go ahead and describe this world in a great detail or in a good manner in and of itself, so that opposition cannot go ahead and do the describing part for you, and they can then weaponize on it, paint the counterfactual world in a worse manner in and of itself. I mean, of course, does that, and they of course can do that, but that's again, that forms a part of the debate in terms of what does the counterfactual world look like. And then lastly, on op, prove how counterfactual would be worse than status quo. So the government has to prove that counterfactual is better than status quo. Opposition has to prove the opposite, which is that the counterfactual in and of itself would be worse than status quo, and how status quo is better. That's how you fulfill burden in regret metrics. We can go to the next part. Okay, this house prefers motions. These are also referred to as THP motions. An example of these motion examples look like, first is this house. Oh wait, I think we've pasted the wrong examples. One second. Yep, the examples basically go ahead and look like this house prefers leaderless social movements, and the examples are given in the further slides as well. You can ignore these. We'll give you the correctly edited slides. Okay, but what do you do in a this house prefers motion? First, this is similar to the other analytical motions which we've gone ahead and described, and then opposition. So here we'll cover three different ways you can go ahead and see a this house prefers motion. So there, opposition is supposed to defend specific comparisons provided by the motions. So let's look at the first way you can come across a this house prefers motion. So if it says this house prefers X, this could look like this house prefers leaderless social movements. So burden on government is to go ahead and tell you why are leaderless social movements better. You can go ahead and give examples of those in terms of how those movements become more inclusive insofar as you don't have a leader. Leaders tend to go ahead and describe who forms a part of the movement, who doesn't. You can go ahead and do multiple things in terms of providing benefits, in terms of why a leaderless movement in and of itself would be better, in terms of promoting collectivization, etc. in of itself, collective decision making. On opposition, you have to go ahead and defend status quo. So you have to go ahead and defend social movements the way they usually take place, and the way they usually take place is that in a sort like a centralized manner. How then you can probably give the benefits of that in terms of quicker decision making, etc. In and of itself. So we'll not go into arguments in depth, but the main idea is just in terms of what is the burden on each side. The burden on government is just to defend a leaderless social movement, and on opposition is to go ahead and defend the status quo. We'll go to the next slide. Yep. The second phrasing of it could be this house prefers X to Y. So this house prefers technocracy to democracy. Or technocracy is basically the form of government which goes ahead and takes place, which is run by technicians or individuals who are specialized in their fields. So environmentalists, etc., or basically individuals who have some sort of like technical expertise in their fields. So here what government has to do is that they have to defend X, which is technocracy, and why that's better than democracy, and opposition has to defend democracy, i.e. why is democracy better than technocracy. So the burdens in this second type are also mentioned quite clearly, that what do you have to defend on government and what do you have to defend on opposition. Which brings me to the third, which is interesting, which is if the motion is phrased, this house prefers a world in which X. Example of that looks like this house prefers a world in which all people have superpowers. So here, government needs to go ahead and describe a world with X and defend it, just like counterfactuals in this house regrets motions. So, for instance, this house prefers a world where you had decentralized religion. Again, here you cannot go ahead and create any hunky dory world. You have to go ahead and look at it this way, that if you go back historically speaking, and you did not have centralized religion, what would the world then have looked like? That's how you can go ahead and make the counterfactual world in a this house prefers motion. That and then so what you need to do is two things. First, you need to describe that world, and second, you of course need to defend it. Opposition has to defend status quo again. What's important to note is opposition cannot make a third world here, that oh, we'll defend a world where some people like good people have superpowers and bad people or rest of the people do not have superpowers and they are humans. The comparative is crystal clear. You have to defend status quo if you're opposition. Oh, cute. Or you have to go ahead and defend. I got distracted by the kitten. Anyway, you have to go ahead and defend status quo on op, and you have to go ahead and defend this world, which is the new world with where people have superpowers. Oh no, no, it's cute. No worries. What exactly does that world look like when individuals have superpowers, and then you need to go ahead and defend that. So yeah, that's on burdens when it comes to this house prefers motions. We can go to the next slide. Okay, we can wait here. We can take up questions. We'll wait for a minute and then we can proceed. Yep, we can go to the next slide. We're doing really well on time. I'm really happy because Akshat took this last time, and Akshat told me that this was going to be a really long session, but we are doing really well on time. Okay, actor motions, and this is the last motion type we have to cover. And this is this house as A would do X. So examples of this look like this house as India would sanction Russia. Second is, and it's a relatively like a longer motion, as a parent from a minority community, this house will teach their children to pursue a mediocre but satisfactory. Yep, Shalini, you can go ahead. Yep, you can unmute. You can ask your question. Oh, I think that was by mistake. That's all right.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so sorry.
No worries, no worries, no worries. Okay, great. So we'll read the second motion. It's slightly a longer one. So, as a parent from a minority community, this house will teach their children to pursue a mediocre but satisfactory, happy life. Oh, that's government. Over a life which, one second, yep, over a life which improves, one second, why is this a little blurry? Okay, Chirag, would it be possible to, like, one second, I'll pin the chat. Uh, okay, great. Yep. I couldn't see the entirety of the screen for a second. All good, all good. Yep. So this house will teach their children to pursue a mediocre but satisfactory life over a happy life, which involves a constant pursuit of excellence and extraordinary. Okay, so if I'll go ahead and take first thing I want to you all to note is that since it's an actor's motion, you'll have to go ahead and debate this motion from the perspective of the actor. So till now, all of the motions which we've gone ahead and debated upon, you had to debate them from like a general sense, or you had to go ahead and debate those in a way what in a way where your outlook should be from that of a general observer, whether or not something should or should not happen. So in a motion that no, we'll cover that example later. But yeah, anyway, so in an actor's motion, first you need to go ahead and the debate happens from A's perspective in particular. So what I'm basically trying to go ahead and say is that, for instance, on government, you have to go ahead and defend a mediocre but a happy life for your child, whereas a life full of excellence but maybe hard work, etc., on opposition. From a neutral perspective, I could probably say that for the child, it would be the best thing to go ahead and have a life of excellence. But that's not what this debate is about. This debate is from the perspective of a parent from a minority community. The then idea then becomes this, that they know that insofar as your some parent knows, insofar as my child is probably from a minority community, they probably don't have a lot of privileges to go ahead and have a life where they'd be able to successfully achieve excellence. At that point in time, it's fine for them to have a mediocre life insofar as they are happy. So what you are basically going ahead and doing is not looking at the debate from the perspective of a neutral observer, but you're looking at it from the perspective of like a parent from a minority community. I'll give you all a similar example. So this house, as India would sanction Russia, what opposition goes ahead and states is that what government goes ahead and states is that India should sanction Russia because at that point in time, Russia is going ahead and invading Ukraine. Insofar as you go ahead and sanction Russia, you're basically going ahead and cutting off a lot of funding which goes to Russia. Therefore, a lot of warfare or weaponry, etc., which they're going ahead and using to cause their war, which is taking place in Ukraine, you go ahead and decrease Russia's capacity to do that. Therefore, Ukrainian individuals would be better off. That's a great argument to make in a general sense, but opposition can simply say that this is an actor's motion. Therefore, if India sanctions Russia, it's probably going to go ahead and look like India not going ahead and getting a lot of oil from Russia. Russian oil prices are really cheap. Insofar as India gets cheap oil from Russia, if they don't sanction Russia, it can go ahead and help a lot of Indian industries because a lot of Indian industries are dependent on oil, like transportation industries, energy industries, etc. If you then go ahead, I mean, these are all links which require a lot of analysis, but I'm just giving you an overarching view of what potentially op can argue. At that point in time, if these industries don't go ahead and get cheap oil, it's likely that the prices of their goods or services also become expensive. Therefore, the people of India would end up getting more expensive energy, etc., and therefore access of a lot of individuals within India, which already has a lot of impoverished or economically backward sections within the society, becomes even worse. Point is, it's causing harm to Indian industries and it's causing harm to individuals who live in India. Since it's an actor's motion, you need to prioritize this over the harm of the life of Ukrainians in and of itself. That's then the if this were an actor motion like it is, that's when ops argument is something which is more relevant because they never tied why Ukrainian lives are directly within the interest of India in and of itself. They can, but again, The point, then I'll come back to this, is that debates happen from A's perspective. You need to consider A's knowledge, their values and interests are, and whether the motion is in A's best interest. Debates are not then about whether action X is necessarily best for the whole world in and of itself. However, with that being said, moral arguments can still be made provided to the teams, given the fact that you argue moral benefits, etc. So, for example, if the motion is about you all, right, you all are the actors. So this house, as Sukriti would do X or Y, you can still go ahead and argue is that you also have some sort of moral values, etc. You also probably don't want to steal, even if it's giving you money, or you probably don't want to hurt other individuals because you care about them, etc. So it's still fine to go ahead, completely fine to go ahead and make moral arguments, insofar as you can go ahead and link why exactly does the individual actually care about those morals, or why does this become individual, or why is this moral argument still in the interest of the actor, or why actor still values to uphold this moral obligation, etc., in and of itself. So just making a moral argument in isolation is something which does not work within within actor motions. You have to link the moral obligation to the actor, why actor cares about this, etc., in and of itself. We'll go to the next slide now. Yep, so the burden on gov and op is simple, which is government has to prove that action X, which is, for instance, living like a mediocre life but a happy life, is in A's best interest. Whereas on opposition, you have to prove that action X is not in A's best interest, i.e., opposition can equally prove that pursuit, i.e., the individual who is the child from the minority community probably has some ambitions, etc., in and of itself, and would want to uphold those ambitions. And since the parents are benevolent actors, are benevolent actors, they care a lot about the child. Therefore, if the child has a lot of happiness, or child gets a lot of happiness by going ahead and pursuing their goals, dreams, etc., and since parents also really care about the child, they are likely to also go ahead and think that pursuing excellence is also in the, so you can argue that pursuing excellence is also in the interests of parents. So you can also argue this motion from op by saying that action X, which is a mediocre life, is not in A's best interest, i.e., parents' best interest. Couple of additional remarks then. A motion worded THW should be treated as an actor motion if, and this is important, if it contains an information slide describing the perspective of an actor, commonly starting with the wording you are a. So I'll give you an example of this. So if you get a context slide which describes a particular actor, the context slide describes a social movement, or it somewhat looks like this, which is you come across a button which, if pressed, will instantly and painlessly erase all human existence. If not pressed immediately, the button will permanently disappear. This is the context slide. And the motion is this house would press the button. Now, in this motion, since an actor is already being described in the context slide, and that's you, then this debate does become an actor motion. So that's one additional remark to be kept in mind in terms of how the motions are framed. So all of the same burdens will go ahead and apply of an actor motion within this motion. Can we go to the next slide? Yep. So again, if some analysis motions may be worded in this way, that this house believes that X is in the interest of Y. This house believes that it is in the interest of India to sanction Russia. These motions are likely to feature similar and in some cases identical arguments to an actor motion as well. So these two examples were just like various ways in which an actor motion can be worded. The main distinction between these motions is that by the virtue of their motion type, they will necessarily involve different burdens. For example, in an actor's motion, government can model out how the actor would go ahead and do X. What do we mean by that? So when there is an overlap between motion types, right? So this house as the US would evade North Korea. So here you have to argue this whether or not you would doing this is in the interest of US on gov and not in the US not in the interest of US on op. That's the argument. So this still remains an actor motion, but you still have some sort of fiat when it comes to what would this like invasion go ahead and look like, because this is still this house would motion as well. So you can still go ahead and give a model in terms of how would this evasion like look like and stuff like that. How would you evade? So this is a mix of an actor's motion plus a policy motion. We can go to the next slide. Yep. So simply, how do you fulfill burdens in an actor's motion? What comes to Gov? Gov has to define the motion, stuff we've covered previously. You have to describe the actor's interests, values, knowledge. Basically, what does the actor look like? So, if India is the actor, what are the interest? What is in the interest of India, etc. In and of itself. Second thing you have to do is show that the actor is in that the show the action is in the best interest of the actor. So, for instance, India going ahead and doing something is in the best interest of India, or India going ahead and sanctioning Russia is in the best interest of India. You have to go ahead and show that. Opposition, you can do two things. First, disagree with the government's interests and show the actor has different interests. Then show how this new set of interests is better by not doing the action. A lot of the times teams tend to describe a lot of interests of the actor, like the actor has three interests and these are those three interests. But a lot of the times in debates you'll have discussions regarding first whether these are the interests of the actors or not. So that's something you can also do on op. Second thing you can also do is discuss about the prioritization of interests. So, for instance, my interest is to go ahead and get social. The debate is about me, right? For instance, the actors Vrinda. So, if the debate is about things like me wanting to go ahead and get social acceptance, get like form good friend circles, etc. That could be one of my interests. Another interest of mine could be to live a safe life, to live a secure life, to literally have food on my table, stuff like that. So both of these are in my interest. Teams have to then also go ahead and additionally compare which interest should be prioritized. So you can then go ahead and give arguments in terms of which interest should be prioritized more in and of itself. But yeah, coming back, you disagree on government's interests and show that the actor can potentially have different interests, and then you show that how this new set of interests is better met by not doing the action. So if you probably can on op argue that, for instance, a new set of interests is survivability, etc. of the actor, and how doing that action on government does not meet survivability, whereas doing the action on opposition meets survivability. Second thing you can do is agree with government's interests, but argue that action X does not meet those interests. So you can agree that sure, you on government actors' interest, we agree that on GovOp, actor interests look like getting more or like having a good friend circle, but actions on government don't necessarily lead to you going ahead and having a good circle. So then you can go ahead and prove that on government, you necessarily don't meet the actors' interests, and those are met better on opposition. You can similarly, like in a policy motion, you have two pathways. Here also you can use even if analysis. So you can on opposition say that we disagree with their interests and we think these are the likely interests, and we'll show you how we meet those likely interests. But even if the judges believe that the interests of the actors are what government team says they are going to be, why do we go ahead and better meet those interests? So you can go ahead and use even if analysis to go ahead and use both of these ways in and of itself. We can go to the next slide. Okay, yep, more points to note. First is to not get confused between these two motion types. So this house believes that US should invade North Korea. The second is this house as the US would invade North Korea. First is from a neutral observer's perspective, whether or not this should or should not be done. This is THBT type 2, the in terms of burdens. Second is an actor's motion. Here, you don't have to debate from a neutral person's perspective. You have to go ahead and debate from the perspective of US in and of itself. The second thing is that this list of motion types is not exhaustive. You have other motions as well, that this house as US regrets Japan's like efforts, etc., remilitarization efforts, or this house fears the rise of China, whatever. The idea is even if we haven't covered these, you can still go ahead and use elimination process. So it's not a THW motion, it's a this house fears motion, so it's not a policy motion. There isn't an actor mentioned, so this is not an actor's motion. So we have to kind of debate this on the basis of it being like an analysis motion. It says fears, so what does that point out to? You probably have to think of metrics on the basis of which a fear would take place, stuff like that. But usually you will not come across motion types beyond this PPT, But if you do, you can still go ahead and use elimination method to go ahead and understand which motion type is being debated upon. Yeah, and another thing which I wanted to cover is fiat in actors motion, right? So this house has the US. So can we go back to the previous slide? One more. Yep. So the motion, this house as the US would evade North Korea. If I'll give you another example, this house as the feminist movement would do X or Y or something, right? So the fiat becomes, so even if it's a THW plus an actor's motion, the fiat becomes different, because here the state, if it's a US example, has a lot of resources, so they can pretty much enact any policy they want. But the feminist movement does not necessarily have the resources to enact any policies or implement any policies. They have limited resources, therefore their fiat in terms of what can they go ahead and do also changes. Now if this changes to a person, this house as person A or this house as Vrinda would do something, right? At that point in time, what is the capacity of one particular individual, that also changes. So that's why the extent of fiat you go ahead and have in motions also changes if it's an actors plus a THW motion combination. Yep, we can go to the next slide. Next slide, next slide. Okay, with that, we are at the end of this session. But it's necessary to acknowledge certain things, which is that this presentation has largely been made possible by referring to the WUDC 2022 updated manual and the Astana EUDC 2022 speaker briefings. We thank the adjudication cores for their respective tournaments of the respective tournaments and all previous adjudication cores who have worked on all of the previous versions of the manual and briefings. Yep, we can go to the next slide. Yeah, with that, we are done. Okay, great. I'll take up all of the questions if there are any right now. If someone does not have any questions, this has been kind of a long session, so feel free to leave, get some food. Yep, all good. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Okay, can we go back to the slide of prop fiat? Perfect. Yep, perfect, great. So fiat just basically refers to, so whenever you have to go ahead and in a THW motion, for instance, you have to go ahead and propose a policy. Fiat is just this, that you assume that the policy will pass the parliament. So if I take an example of this motion, this house will reserve a third of the seats for women in parliament. What teams cannot argue is that no, it will not pass the parliament. So that's what you go ahead and assume, that the policy which you have suggested or the model you have gone ahead and suggested, it will pass the parliament in and of itself. But post that, all of the other criticisms are still within the debate. So, oh, if you pass the policy, what's going to be the reaction of the people? No worries. Thank you so much for attending. Yep. So, if you pass the policy, is it going to lead to public backlash, or what's going to be the impact of that on the economy? Because a lot of these could be policies which impact the economy, etc., as well. So, for instance, harms like women who got into parliament on the basis of their merit, how they might go ahead and feel as an outcome of this reservation, or how even if this reservation takes place, the women who would actually get seats within the parliament, would those be the women who can actually bring about change for the women on the ground, etc., or would these just be really privileged women who cannot even, or are unlikely to bring about change which favors the women on the ground, etc., who are in bad living conditions, etc. All of these are criticisms which go beyond the idea that, oh, this policy will or will not be passed. All of these are fair things for opposition to argue. So these are things which opposition can go ahead and argue, but what opposition cannot question is, first, whether or not this policy will pass the parliament, or second is just on resources, that oh, this policy will not be passed because government does not have the resources to carry out the policy. You assume that whatever resources are required, government has those, and if there's a counter policy, you also assume that opposition will have the similar quantity of resources to implement their counter proposition policy or counter prop model in and of itself. So that's just prop fiat. Prop fiat also changes the way it interacts with actor motions. So if it's a feminist movement and it's like this house as the feminist movement would do A, B, and C, or would do A or some action, right? For instance, this house as the feminist movement would oppose policies which incentivize marriage. If that's the motion, at that point in time, you cannot go ahead and argue that the way feminist movement is going to go ahead and oppose marriages is by passing a policy in the parliament. Feminist movement cannot do that. So it can like doesn't necessarily have the resources to even do that. So at that point in time, fiat changes when you have to think of various ways. What are the like what can feminist movement do then, since their resources are relatively limited? So but usually in thw motions where it's assumed that the state is passing the policy, like this is a policy which the state would pass, or banning consumption of like alcohol, or banning cigarettes, or banning drugs, these are all state policies which are going to be passed. So here you assume that whatever model you have will pass. That's prop fiat. Okay, great. No worries, no worries. Yep, everyone, we are kind of done with the session. Feel free to stay back if you have any doubts. Thank you so much for joining.